go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kim Schreiner. I'm the founder and president of the Phil Simon Clinic Tanzania Project. And this is part of our ongoing speaker series, which has been, my goodness, we've been going for about, 3 years, I think, Ariel, something like that. Tonight, we're really honored to have Kathleen Ryan. Kathleen is a wonderful person, and she has a wonderful daughter who is our. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kim Schreiner. I'm the founder and president of the Phil Simon Clinic Tanzania Project. And this is part of our ongoing speaker series, which has been, my goodness, we've been going for about, 3 years, I think, Ariel, something like that. Tonight, we're really honored to have Kathleen Ryan. Kathleen is a wonderful person, and she has a wonderful daughter who is our administrator, Ariel Herbert. And so I'm going to introduce her in a second, but I first wanted to just make a comment about some of the difficulties that we've been dealing with over the last couple of weeks. As many of you know, the Phil Simon Clinic was started at Huntington Hospital in Pasadena. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, we are still battling some pretty significant fires here. We've had a very devastating event in North Pasadena and West Altadena. And of course, the Palisades fire in West Los Angeles, and now there's a large one burning outside in Castaic. So this really speaks, I think, to the urgency of addressing the climate issues on our planet and how that drives weather changes. Unfortunately, these fires have been accompanied by some loss of life, and we really reach out and support the folks that are going through this more personally than some of us. I was heartened to see the wonderful salutations and sympathies that came from all of our Tanzanian scholars and students that we support in East Africa. They've been very concerned about what they've been seeing in the news, and it's just such a heartfelt message to get from them, and speaks to the bond that we have with these wonderful young people who have been part of this project. So just keep them in mind, be safe, and remember that that life does go on, but we really have some big challenges over the next many years here with some of these issues. One of the interesting aspects of working in resource-poor countries is that I think increasingly many nonprofits are recognizing the totality and the interrelationship between the environment, animals, and humans. And certainly at Phil Simon Clinic Tanzania Project, we have been very engaged with the role that animals play in human health and both mental health and also physiologic health, and how important it is to take what we refer to as a One Health approach, where we really consider factors outside of just human medicine when we're talking about significant medical problems. And tonight's speaker has taken an interest and has an unusual CV in that she is an attorney. I'm a doctor. Sometimes attorneys and doctors are a little bit on the other sides of the fence, but this is an occasion where this kind of attorney is just super. We're really delighted to have her here. Kathleen trained at Penn State, where she received her JD, and she is one of the lead experts in intellectual property at the law firm Olilla Law Group in Colorado. But her passion is in the aspects of international and law and global health, and how that impacts animal conservation and human conservation, I suppose, in parts of the world. She's been particularly interested and invested in a project that's been going on in Mali. Mali is a Central African country that has experienced enormous pressures from long history of colonialism and then political instability, sometimes political stability for a short period of time. They've recently had, of course, a quite significant civil war. But in the midst of all of this, dedicated individuals have established the Mali Elephant Project. And I believe this is going to be the platform that Kathleen is going to discuss in terms of how this kind of law and this kind of global awareness is important in stabilizing countries, but also protecting animals and some of the legal aspects of this. So I'm really interested to hear what she has to say, and we welcome you, Kathleen, and thank you for doing this.
Great, thank you, Kim. Good evening and welcome, everyone. It's great to be connected via Zoom to people from all over the world. and to talk about such an important project. I'm honored to be a guest speaker this evening for the Phil Simon Clinic Tanzania Project speaker series. And first, I'd like to echo Kim's comments and express my own deepest sympathy for those who've lost so much in these terrible fires. And our thoughts are truly with you. The Tanzania Project's commitment to equitable and affordable healthcare and education in communities in East Africa is invaluable. Um, so, by way of background, I'll fill in a little bit. Kim, you did a great job. I am an attorney specializing in intellectual property law for about 2 decades, but I've always been deeply passionate about animal advocacy and conservation. So during COVID, I decided to step into my passion, which led me to return to law school, earning a master's in international animal law. And being part of the legal program really gave me an introduction to so many areas of the law with respect to animals, legislative efforts for anti cruelty, regulations of animals in zoos and exhibitions, efforts to enforce existing international conservation treaties, and studying human wildlife coexistence and conflict, which I found very interesting. And so I became fascinated with the Mali Elephant Project, which started in 2003 to protect a very special herd of desert adapted elephants that migrate a huge amount of miles through the Central African Saharan Desert in the country of Mali. The project was undertaken by the International Conservation Fund of Canada and the Wild Foundation here in the States. And in 2022, I wrote an article about the project for the Lewis and Clark Center for Animal Law Studies journal, and I've continued to follow their efforts since then. And for this presentation, I was extremely fortunate to be able to interview the founders of the project, Dr. Susan Canney, who's with the International Conservation Fund of Canada, and who currently teaches at Oxford University, and Vance Martin, co-leader of the project and former executive director of the Wild Foundation. And both Susan and Vance have dedicated their lives to conservation efforts, and their achievements around the globe are extensive and really impactful. Their Mali Elephant Project is captivating to me. It makes space for the elephants while improving the local livelihoods and fostering sustainable grassroots community-led environmental management. And the fact that this integrated model of human-elephant coexistence has continued since 2003 against all odds actually is no more than remarkable. But equally intriguing is that this conservation model has the potential to be replicated in other conservation contexts. So the animals, the people, the geographic area may all be different, but the underlying model may serve as a blueprint for other wildlife conservation efforts around the world, which I believe makes the project worthwhile in the larger conservation context. Mali's desert elephants are just one of two elephant populations adapted for desert life. And this group undertakes the longest ever recorded elephant migration in the world. This elephant population migrates thousands of miles along a Saharan trading route in a conflict zone. So to say conserving this elephant population was a challenge would be an understatement. And nevertheless, against all odds, the elephant population still survives. And I think it's thanks largely to the team's dedication and their unique approach. So from the beginning to the present, the project has had a significant impact on the local communities, their habitat, and of course, for the elephants. Today, there are more than 8 million square acres of elephant habitat with enhanced protection supporting a herd of more than 300 elephants who are just roaming across the deserts in Mali. So for the approach, the conventional Western approach typically has like a top-down method. It sees the problem, it analyzes the problem, and then it gets started fixing the problem. And historically, these approaches can be successful in solving problems, and the project has employed many of these conventional tools. However, the huge migration routes, the multiple ethnic tribes, fractured legal systems, and strong competing commercial interests, which I would add are really at the root of most conservation challenges, but they made implementing the solely conventional approach impossible. So the project started at the bottom. It recognized that one, it needed to use the conventional tools, but not in a vacuum, but in a way that fit into the local context and continually adapted to the ever-changing situations. And to succeed, the project realized that they needed to start with their key resource, the local people. And in the beginning, the problem seemed insurmountable. The elephants were just wandering through 3.2 million hectares, or over 12,000 square miles, of sub-Saharan desert. And it was clear that the encroachment of humans threatened their survival of the herd by disrupting their migration routes and ruining essential habitats, and later poaching of the herd. And if these problems continued, with certainty there would be increased conflict between the elephants and the people, more drought, more poaching, greater stress, until the population diminished to the point of disappearing. And that would really be a travesty because this elephant population has unique genetic properties that allow it to adapt to this desert situation, and those properties would be lost forever. So the conventional approach would have been to create a designated protected area, securing the migration route, capturing the poachers, and preserving the water resources. All necessary for the survival of the elephants, but not possible in the beginning. For starters, designated protected areas require a foundation of legal agreements to enforce and oversee. Now, such legal agreements are permitted under Mali's decentralized law, which I'll discuss later, but at the time there were no legal agreements in place to enforce and oversee a designated biosphere reserve. And getting 17 communes with multiple tribes and ethnic groups to agree on a set of legal terms was a huge undertaking. So if the project adopted only the conventional approach, they would have needed significant financial investment, government involvement, and community interest. And in the beginning, they had none of these critical support structures. So again, when they determined that the people were their only resource, and so the people were critical to approaching the problem. And the question was how to approach the people. So from late 2002 to 2006, the project did nothing but research and study migration routes. They had GPS collars for the elephants. They had satellite data to track their habits and routes. And after several years of this, they felt like they had enough information to begin interacting with the local people. So they started with a series of workshops in key areas of the elephant range that included as many groups as possible: tribal and elected community leaders, government bodies, and representative NGOs. These workshops were critical to cultivating an understanding of the attitudes of the local people, and they became keystones of the project in the beginning and continuing today. So at these workshops, rather than telling the people that the elephants had value, and we were going to protect them, which might have been the story in the top-down approach, the project aimed to balance the top-down and bottom-up activities. And they presented their research and asked the community a series of questions, such as whether the community thought their research was correct, and what, if anything, did they have to add, What did they consider the problems to be? And what solutions would they propose? And by having these conversations with the people, the project learned that the people connected deeply with the land and the animal. And as it turned out, overwhelmingly 86% of the people wanted the elephants to survive. They believed that the survival of the elephants was connected to their own survival. And if the elephants disappeared, it meant the environment was struggling to support life, including their lives. So, realizing that the local communities had this highly developed ecological literacy was encouraging to the project. However, despite the ecological literacy and the desire to preserve the elephants, the local community struggled because commercial interests and money incentivized destruction of the environment. Most people in the West, including myself before I undertook my studies, are unaware of the paradox faced by local communities like this. People who feel like they must live off environmental destruction. I mean, they don't want to cut down the forest, but in many cases, that's the only way they can earn a living. So, without addressing these core economic drivers, the project realized they would need a lot of resources and money to incentivize a solution, and they didn't have these resources. But the project saw an opening here and concluded that if you want to have cooperation and collaboration, the people must see their interest in solutions. And the project already knew that the people had one major self interest, namely their own existence. So, in addition to cooperating with the local people, another key insight was using existing legal structures. This is the decentralized Mali laws I talked about earlier, to build coalitions between the many different tribes and ethnic groups. So, interesting, Mali, like several other African countries, has a decentralized government system that puts resources under the natural resources under the control of local communities. This system gives the local communities tenure rights over their own natural resources, a bundle of rights, if you will, comprised of the right to access, use, manage, exclude others, and utilize land and resources as they saw fit. So there was a built in legal structure for the local autonomy. So the structure gave the local communities the power to draw up conventions that are basically legal agreements that set out the rules for using resources and creating sanctions for breach of the agreements. And although the existence of this legal structure was available to all groups, I mean, even prior to the project, there was a lack of cohesion and communication that stymied effective resource management. And although the various ethnic groups and tribes had their own systems to manage resources widely, there was no uniform set of rules that were accepted and respected by, all the ethnic groups. And it seemed like it was always in someone's interest to overexploit the resources before somebody else got to them. And this fractured system impaired sustainable resource management and actually contributed to environmental degradation. And rather working together, the different clans focused on their own systems without consideration for the others' resources. And this resulted in a tragedy of commons, a conservation term where shared resources are depleted due to independent, self interested actions that often negatively impact the common good. So, to solve the problem by building cohesion, the project brought them all together to talk about their problems in relation to the environmental overexploitation. And they asked some important questions. What is the problem? What are you going to do about that? And what systems do you need? And the answers to these questions showed clearly that they needed a system that was transparent and a system that everyone respected, that represented all the ethnic groups, and to develop a shared understanding and a necessary unity. Otherwise, nobody would cooperate. So they created a system. They started with a community of respected elders that represented all the ethnic groups. And they needed good people on these committees, which meant they needed to identify the qualities of the elders that were important. And once these qualities were defined, they nominated the elders. And then they repeated the process with the eco guardians, who were unarmed young men that patrolled and watched the elephants and would build fire breaks to protect pasture to the benefit of the communities. And so again, they defined what qualities of the men were important, they nominated them, and eventually these eco guardians became well regarded within the community. In addition to the transparency and inclusion, the system had to be equitable. Otherwise, people would cheat and exploit the system, which would destroy the trust and unity and ultimately be unsustainable. As an added benefit is that the community-based natural resource management committees that the project created provided additional income to the people. For example, through support of women's empowerment groups engaged in sustainable harvest of non-timber forest projects. So, with a system in place that unified all the ethnic groups and was seen as trustworthy by the people, the project was able to work with the local communities to draw up the legal agreements that would effectively manage the natural resources for the common good. And this model has proven sustainable, which is the reason the biosphere has grown over time and that the elephants still live. So the project was not static. It had to adapt over time to different challenges. In 2009, huge herds of cattle came to Lake Benzina, the keystone source of water for the elephants during the dry season, and threatened to dry up the lake before the rain. And the crisis also impacted multiple ethnic tribes because they also needed the water. So, to understand the threat, the project again turned to the local community. The project conducted a comprehensive survey using a local team that included a social anthropologist that was also the son of a well-respected local chief. And the survey was translated into multiple dialects, and picture booklets were distributed to the people who did not read. And from this survey, they learned that 96% of the cattle didn't even belong to anyone in the local community. Rather, they belonged to local cattle raisers in distant cities. And this situation is common when communities don't communicate in a cohesive way, and it can really contributes to overexploitation of the local resources for outside interests at the expense of the local communities, and in this case, the elephants. In addition, the project learned that the ethnic groups suffered from a high incidence of waterborne diseases. And to their surprise, 3 local clans indicated that they would be happy to relocate out of the elephant range to an area with suitable pasture and clean borehole water, provided there were 3 separate boreholes due to the relationship among the clans. And I think this is a great example of making room for the elephants while improving the lives of the local people. And I mentioned earlier the significant challenges and working in the conflict zone. Civil war broke out in 2012, and the history behind the conflict, which I won't go into here, is interesting because it was largely precipitated by the fall of Gaddafi. And at that point, vast quantities of armed men and guns and other weapons started flowing out of Libya and streaming into Mali. And the project actually watched the caravans of trucks carrying the weapons into Mali. So there was a military coup, and there was a coup, and the military took over. They expelled the French and the UN peacekeepers, and actually then brought in the Russians. Insecurity got worse, and the project faced the situation in a familiar way, starting with information gathered through local meetings. The concerns had changed and were now centered on the inability to access grain, as vehicles were being hijacked. And in 2015, the poaching increased, obviously because there were so many more guns, and the community elders, who were well respected, now issued edicts declaring a social norm that poachers were thieves, stealing from the community, which was a source of great shame because a number of the poachers actually came from the community. And interestingly, armed insurgent groups typically and often conscript the local youth. And in a hugely significant development, none of the eco guards joined the armed insurgents, even though they would have been paid better. So as the conflict escalated, poaching again escalated. And when the eco guards requested armed support, the project created an anti-poaching unit that was trained by Chengeta Wildlife, which provided expert training and leadership for the anti-poaching unit. And it had a holistic community approach similar to the projects. And these efforts have been successful in reducing poaching, with no reported incidents of poaching since March 2020. And in early 2021, the Wagner Group, a notorious Russian group of mercenaries, arrived in Mali, and the conflict escalated. The mercenaries established an enlisted to counter the rebels, reportedly have abducted and killed people, including people working with the project, which has experienced an execution, an assassination, and multiple robberies. The project is again adapting, and there is some good news. The herd is stable with 300 plus elephants, and poaching is at a low level. And despite the challenges, the project continues using its core concepts and working closely with the people, which may be the only reason that it's been able to continue. Dr. Canney told me that the project is the only organization that has continued working in Mali over time. Other humanitarian groups come in, provide some aid, and then they leave. Plus, most of the people in Mali can't go anywhere. So while the people remain there, the project can work through them. Dr. Canney told me that this latest issue with the drone war gives pause of whether to shut down the project, but the local people want to continue. And as mentioned earlier, at the beginning of the project, creating a designated protected area just wasn't feasible. But it was clear that these elephants needed the whole entire area for their migration. And now, in spite of war and escalating conflict, the protected area has grown to about 4 million hectares or 10 million acres. And just last month, the local project leader, Nomba Ganame, received the Prince William Award from the highly acclaimed Tusk Awards for his unwavering dedication to preserving the Mali elephants. The other good news is that this model may be applicable in other conservation efforts and creates efficiencies by engaging the local people. They get their thoughts, they bring them on board, and the local people have an interest to do the best thing locally. So that's easy for them. And starting by working with the people, fostering local autonomy to improve livelihoods, while making space for the elephants is a win-win. So before I finish up and take questions, I'd like to show you some slides from the project. So just excuse me while I figure out how to share my screen. Okay. And here are two members of the elephant tribe. Here you see the local committee, the management committee's meeting. It appears they're discussing some of the terms of the legal agreements. And here you see the larger local communities that meeting that involved all of the larger population of the local communities. And you can see it's very well attended. Here are some eco guards discussing their training. These eco guards are young men I mentioned that chosen for their certain qualities. They're between 18 and 35 years old and do enormously good work. And I believe currently there are, I think, 1,700 eco guards in the Mali project. And here you see a smaller group of elders discussing various issues and solutions, I hope. And this is the photo from Lake Banzina crisis. And you can see that there are a lot of cattle. In fact, there were over 50,000 head of cattle that moved into Lake Banzina, which created an enormous crisis for the local communities as well as the elephants, obviously. And here you see some of the eco guards building a fire break. And these fire breaks are good for a lot of different things, but they really support the community because they preserve the pasture area. And with better pasture, the local community's livestock, they call it fattening, they really get robust and bring in a lot more money for the local community. And they also produce more milk to feed the people. And you can see it's very Saharan, more eco guards on their camels. And I love this picture, just an eco guard watching from a distance the elephants who try to find shade wherever they can. And this is a photo that shows the the efforts of the local committee to provide additional livelihoods for the local women. They are harvesting grass that's sustainable and a non-timber project. This photo, I'm sorry, is blurry, but I just love the image of the women uh, undertaking their projects. And that is some of their sustainable um, vegetation that they grow. And this is the picture of a map of the area where Mali exists in the Sahel. It's this region between the Sahara Desert and the savanna to the south. And finally, just a few photos of these iconic creatures. I mean, they're just such sentient beings and so inspiring. They actually have very short tusks and great big feet to undertake and long legs to undertake their long migration. And here's just a little collage of them enjoying their habitat. So
That's just terrific, Kathleen. It just, I'm looking at a Tanzanian elephant right now in my office, and yeah, I was noticing that their tusks were so much shorter, and that they're not leaner, but they're definitely lankier than the Saharan or the sub-Saharan elephants.
right in the south.
Yeah,
Yes.
excellent. So let's just open it up into question. I have a few questions as well, but let's see. I think that Louise Gonde asked a question about what is the economic benefit or relationship between the elephants and the local communities? Do they get direct economic improvements by protecting the elephants?
I am unaware of direct economic improvements from directly protecting the elephants, but one, they see their existence intertwined with the elephants, and their very existence is paramount. So that's one benefit. The other benefits are just learning how to manage their own resources effectively, which has brought money to the group. And that Lake Banzina crisis, I believe they were able to get compensated for the cattle that overran Lake Banzina. And of course, improving the local livelihoods of the women is a keystone of the project. Saving the pasture land is a keystone, and the effective management resource so that third parties aren't coming in and degrading their resources where that money doesn't stay in the community. It's for the benefit of wealthy people who don't even live there. And finally, I think the fact that the eco guards were able to withstand conscription into the conflict is also not money in their pockets, but it's also those men are their resources as well. So those can stay in the community. Good question.
It's yeah, it's a great question. It's interesting to see how much social science was involved in all of this. And my question would be for the folks that sort of were inspired to start this project, um, who did they reach out to first? Was the local elders, or what was sort of the liaison between the project founders and the village and the people in the area in terms of understanding kind of the social structure and the kind of societal positions.
Yeah, great question. I wish Vance and Susan were here. I think from what I've researched that 3-year period between researching and then interacting with the people gave them a treasure trove of information, not only about the elephants, but about the local communities and how many ethnic tribes there were, and doing things like identifying a social anthropologist who could help with the survey and was also the son of a tribal chief was kind of genius. So I think that research was a keystone, and it also informed where they would begin the project. I mean, it's a vast area, but they must have had some inkling of where to begin, and that was no doubt informed also by some connections and relationships that they were able to build while they were researching.
Yeah, it speaks to the, again, sort of the One Health idea that even in anthropologic structures of human communities and animal communities, that they're intertwined, and recognizing that can help in these kind of projects. One of our listeners asked about what motivates the Russians to be in Mali. I don't know if you have any expertise and insight into that, Kathleen, in terms of resources and natural resources that they may have in their.
It's interesting you should that question came up because uh, in the 2012 coup, where they expelled the colonial French government and the UN peacekeepers, Dr. Canney told me that she believed that whole coup was fomented by the Russians, who often come in and then, yes, of course, they're looking for the natural resources, and that's kind of their MO. Um, and in the chat, there will be a Lawfare podcast link for anybody that's interested with Vonda Felbad Brown, who is the uh, she's the director of the initiative on non-state armed actors, and they're talking about the Russians and the Russian aligned mercenaries. And if anyone's really interested to hear that kind of what's going on, that podcast is excellent, and it will be in the chat notes. Interestingly, the Russian mercenaries Wagner Group has totally rebranded after the demise of their leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who you may recall instituted a coup against Putin over the Ukrainian war and was subsequently blown up in an airplane suspiciously. So now they've completely rebranded to be the Africa Corps and dropped the Wagner name, but I think they're still up to their tricks.
It's not the best choice in names given the history of Africa cores in the past, but that's another topic. A question sort of from a biologic standpoint with genetic diversity, I'm always concerned about isolated populations of animals. And is there any communication with other elephant specialists or zoologists in attachment in sort of adjacent areas in terms of maintaining genetic diversity among this population? These are highly specialized elephants, obviously. But that's always a concern when population of animals are kind of isolated and they don't have any kind of mixing. You can see it in our own wildlife here in Southern California with mountain lions and so forth. So did
Right.
you hear anything about that in terms of sort of the genetic stability of the herd?
I have not. I have not. I do know there are concerns of, um, in the creating the protected area, they push the elephants into a very small, isolated, fractured environment, and that I think contributes to the lack of genetic diversity. But I don't know, I'll be honest, I could look it up, but I don't know if they've employed any geneticists or type of scientists that are in that field.
You mentioned the drone war, Kathleen. Is that what it sounds like? These little gizmos flying around with things of destruction attached to them, or how does that impact the elephants and or the communities there?
It's devastating. It's devastating because the jihadists hide in with the civilian population, and so the the civilians are being killed as the drone war attacks the jihadists, which seems to be a familiar war tactic. And the project is addressing those kinds of attacks and the insecurity um, by changing a lot of their tactics. I mean, it used to be that the field manager was out in the field, but now the field manager has to stay in Bamako, the capital, because he's at such high risk of kidnapping. And they now notify the military to let the military know when they're conducting their activities like building firewalls or fire breaks, to let them know that they're not the jihadists. So they've had to implement a number of uh, reactions to the escalating conflict.
What about, you mentioned, one of the things one of the questions you thought might come up would be about wildlife tourism and what role that would play in, supporting conservation efforts like this. Obviously, inviting people into a war zone is a little tricky. I don't think the travel insurance would cover that probably, but is there some, there seems to be that I think that certainly we can see that perhaps a little bit with the mountain-back gorillas in Rwanda, is that in terms of a very highly conserved animal that they benefited by bringing in a lot of tourists to
Yes.
visit them. So, and we certainly see that in Tanzania, with Serengeti and Ngorongoro and all these other places. So, is that something that the Malayans could ever get in?
The Mali has no tourism.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for the UN peacekeepers, it was designated the most dangerous place on the planet.
Right.
But as Dr. Canney told me, the Mali Elephant Project is not about commodifying the nature, but people get benefits through the committee's community programs, the women's initiatives, the care of the pastures, support of the livestock. All that brings in revenue, and it's not a lot of money, but a small amount can can drastically improve the quality of people's lives. And as far as wildlife tourism in general to support conservation efforts. There's a concept that uh, conservation must pay its way or nature must pay its way. And according to Dr. Canney, and I totally agree the concept is wrong, she in fact believes that we should be paying and thanking nature for sustaining us. And the idea that nature must be commodified just to bring in revenue is really offensive. And truly, even where there is tourism and trophy hunting, that money doesn't really go to the local communities. But I think some countries are making efforts to have that tourism money go to the locals. Like I believe Namibia is trying to make sure the benefits are shared and the income is shared. Um, and really, in most of Africa, the tourism and trophy hunting, as repugnant as I find trophy hunting, is actually stopping large tracts of lands from being converted into farmland, which contributes to desertification. So the commercial efforts are actually protecting large tracts of land. And some people argue that without the trophy hunting, which now are the Saudis bringing in like huge gas and diesel Range Rovers, they say that, they would be converted into farmland and the habitat would be lost. But personally, I believe that while tourism is important, ecotourism and without the trophy hunting can still save large tracts of land without having to murder the animals, such as these ecologically sensitive safaris.
Yeah. Uh, I think that, and then in terms of you know, the impact, I mean, when one of these species disappears, it has sort of an effect of just a sort of a domino effect where that it really changes the environment. I was thinking back to the first question of what's sort of the economic benefit of the elephants to the people. There may be certainly things that haven't been well studied because this is not an area where you can do a lot of research because of all the political unrest. But for example, with how the elephants change the topography, or how the elephants change the nutritions in the soil when they defecate, and their effect on different kinds of vegetation that may enhance agriculture for some of the villagers, even though the elephants, can often go in and eat their agriculture. So I think there's probably things that we don't know about that are of benefit with indigenous peoples that have lived off the land and the animals that have been with them for thousands of years. And we see that all over the world, obviously, even in our own country. But we also can see the deleterious effects of when you move those populations out. And they're often genetically related in many ways, both in terms of the microbiology of their digestive systems and the communities themselves. So I think that it isn't just the elephants that they're protecting and preserving and saving. It really is the community, not just the anthropological and societal parts of the community, but also the health of the community itself. And I think that which speaks to the power of just a project that's little like this, but my goodness, such a dangerous place. And has Dr. Canney been there many times? And
Yes, yes,
yikes.
both Vance Martin and Dr. Canney have been there many times.
Yeah.
I think Vance lives his life on an airplane. So, because he has a lot of other projects he's undertaking.
Yeah. I think Molly was one place that Clarissa Ward didn't want to go for CNN, and that woman goes to the worst places in the world. So that just speaks how dangerous
Yeah,
Molly is. So, um, other questions for Kathleen? This has been a fascinating topic. Maybe you could just give us an idea of is protecting wildlife in the international law of this is this a profession that's catching on or is becoming more visible or more powerful in governments?
yes, I think so. And the Mali government is now involved. Um, I uh, I know that in Malaysia they're protecting the central spine forest in the peninsular Malay Peninsula, and the Malaysian government is involved. And there are some very well regarded and um, ecologically concerned ranger groups, that are not just out there to, get guns and kill poachers. I mean, they're actually also concerned with the wildlife. And I was surprised in my international law degree courses that, there were people from all over the world in this program, and several from Tanzania who were previously in the ministry or working in uh, government in some capacity, like criminal enforcement of wildlife trafficking. And so there are people all over the globe that are interested in this, and I think that was one eye opener for me, because it's not just in one country or another country. It seems like it's a global movement. Now, I think it's small, but it's certainly there and growing. And um, these people all go back to their government jobs with a new understanding of conservation and enforcement.
That's terrific. That's gives us a little hope for this poor little planet of ours. It's just having some troubles lately. So I know that Jane Goodall would be, and she certainly has spoken to this very early on in terms of engaging communities, local communities, and really empowering them. And I think that this is a good example of that. Boy, we hope that they really continue to be successful. And Molly, I have not been there. My brother's actually been there a couple of times, but they are known for fabulous music. They have two of some of the best musicians, Baba Mal and Salif Keita, both fascinating musicians themselves, and it's just I think, a really rich culture of arts and music, it's
Great. And history, just it's
and
ancient.
history.
Really. Yeah.
Yeah, very ancient history, very, very important anthropologic history, but also civilized history. Just really fascinating area of the world. So, are there other questions for Kathleen? Well, I thank you very much, Kathleen. This is
Thank
just a
you.
super, super topic and very interesting. I was fascinated to hear about it, and I think it's really enlightened a lot of us. And I appreciate all of everybody wants to capture, maybe able to screenshot that, capture the websites that RL has put up there for us. I think that's terrific. So,
Yeah.
really a wonderful, wonderful lecture. So,
Thank you all. My pleasure.
well, thank you. And